Principal Rodriguez was halfway through apologizing to the school board about the incident with the elderly substitute teacher when he opened her personnel file for the first time and found a resume that made his hand shake. Dr. Margaret Chen, Ph.D., Aerospace Engineering, NASA Mission Control 1987 to 2018, Lead Trajectory Specialist for Mars Landing Program, Classified Security Clearance Level 5. And suddenly, the woman his students had humiliated wasn't just a substitute teacher. She was a legend. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Jefferson High School, with the usual chaos of teenagers rushing through hallways, teachers clutching coffee cups like lifelines, and the perpetual struggle to maintain order in an institution that seemed to thrive on controlled chaos. When the regular chemistry teacher called in sick at the last minute, the substitute coordinator had scrambled to find a replacement, eventually settling on Margaret Chen, an 80-year-old woman who had recently registered with the district's substitute pool and was available on short notice. Margaret arrived at 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes before classes began, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had seen better decades and wearing a simple cardigan that her granddaughter had bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, secured with bobby pins that struggled against the morning humidity, and her thick-rimmed glasses, unfashionable by modern standards but perfectly functional, perched on her nose as she squinted at the room numbers trying to find classroom 237. The students noticed her immediately when she entered the chemistry lab, moving slowly and deliberately as she tried to familiarize herself with the layout. To 17-year-old minds accustomed to young, energetic teachers who understood their cultural references and could navigate technology without assistance, Margaret looked like someone's grandmother who had wandered into the wrong building. "Oh my God, is she seriously our teacher today?" whispered Jessica Martinez to her lab partner, not bothering to lower her voice enough to avoid being overheard.
"I bet she doesn't even know what an iPhone is," added Brandon Clark, pulling out his phone to film what he anticipated would be an entertaining morning of watching an elderly woman struggle with modern classroom technology. Margaret heard the whispers, of course. Her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but decades of working in mission control, where the difference between success and catastrophe often lay in catching a whispered concern from an engineer across a crowded room, had taught her to listen for important sound, even when they weren't meant for her ears. She had heard similar comments before, in other classrooms, from other students who saw only her age and appearance and assumed they knew everything about her capabilities. She said nothing as she unpacked her briefcase, removing a tablet that was surprisingly modern and a notebook filled with handwritten lesson plans. The students exchanged glances, some already texting friends in other classes about the ancient substitute in chemistry, others recording video clips they planned to share on social media later. "Good morning," Margaret said once the bell rang, her voice clear but quiet, requiring the students to actually pay attention if they wanted to hear her. "I'm Mrs. Chen, and I'll be your substitute teacher today." A few students in the back rows snickered. Margaret pretended not to notice.
"Your regular teacher left instructions for today's lesson on chemical reactions and molecular bonds," she continued, moving toward the smartboard with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world with joints that didn't move as smoothly as they once had. What happened next became the catalyst for everything that followed. As Margaret attempted to turn on the smartboard, she fumbled with the controls, pressing buttons that brought up the wrong screens and menus that made no sense to her. The students' whispers grew louder, more confident, as they watched her struggle with technology that they had mastered in elementary school. "This is painful to watch," someone muttered from the middle of the room. "Maybe we should help her find the nursing home," another voice added, followed by muffled laughter. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from a neurological condition that was the inevitable result of 8 decades of life. as she tried to navigate the unfamiliar interface. In her day, teaching had involved chalk and blackboards, overhead projectors at the most advanced. This digital ecosystem of touchscreens and wireless connections was as foreign to her as a spacecraft cockpit would be to most people. Which was ironic, considering she had spent 31 years working in actual spacecraft control rooms.
The situation deteriorated when she accidentally activated the board's camera function, projecting a close-up image of her confused face onto the large screen for the entire class to see. The students erupted in barely controlled laughter, several phones now recording openly, and Margaret Chen's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to figure out how to turn off the camera. "Can someone please help Mrs. What was your name again?" called out Sarah Kim from the front row, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension that teenagers perfect when addressing adults they perceive as incompetent. "Chen," Margaret replied quietly, still pressing buttons in an attempt to regain control of the technology. "Right, Mrs. Chen, can someone help her before she breaks something?" The laughter was open now, no longer hidden behind hands or whispered to neighbors. Phones were recording, social media posts were being composed, and Margaret Chen, who had once been responsible for calculations that guided billion-dollar spacecraft across millions of miles of empty space, found herself humiliated by a piece of classroom technology that cost less than her coffee maker. It was at that moment that Tyler Watson, a particularly cruel 17-year-old with a talent for identifying weakness and exploiting it for entertainment, stood up and said loudly enough for the entire class to hear, "Maybe we should call someone to come pick up their grandma. I think she's lost."
The room erupted in laughter, and Margaret felt something break inside her chest, not physically, but emotionally. The kind of break that happens when dignity is stripped away in public, when a lifetime of accomplishments becomes invisible beneath the weight of other people's assumptions. She turned away from the smartboard, gathered her materials with as much composure as she could manage, and said quietly, "I'll be right back. Please read chapter 12 while I'm gone." Margaret walked out of classroom 237 with her head held high, but tears were forming behind her glasses as she made her way to the main office. She had taught substitute classes for 6 months since registering with the district, and while there had been challenging moments, nothing had prepared her for the outright cruelty she had just experienced. The main office was buzzing with its usual mid-morning activity when Margaret entered. Secretaries were answering phones, dealing with late students, and managing the countless small crises that keep a high school functioning. Principal Rodriguez was in his office, visible through the glass walls, speaking animatedly on the phone with someone who was clearly unhappy about something. Margaret approached the main desk and waited patiently for the secretary to finish her phone call. "Yes, honey," asked Mrs. Patterson, the head secretary, looking up with the kind of professionally pleasant expression that educational administrators perfect over years of practice. "I'm Mrs. Chen, the substitute teacher in room 237, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was feeling. "I'm afraid there's been an incident, and I think it would be best if I left for the day." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to concern. Substitute teachers walking out midday was never a good sign, and she had seen enough of these situations to know that student behavior was usually the culprit. "What happened, dear?" Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain what had occurred without sounding like she was simply unable to handle a classroom full of teenagers. "The students were disrespectful. I don't think I'm the right fit for this particular class." It was at that moment that Principal Rodriguez finished his phone call and emerged from his office, catching the tail end of the conversation. He was a man in his early 50s,
who had dedicated his career to education, working his way up from classroom teacher to administrator through a combination of genuine care for students and an understanding that sometimes teenage behavior required firm intervention.
"Mrs. Chen, is everything all right?" he asked, approaching the desk with the kind of concerned expression that suggested he was already calculating how to rearrange the day's schedule to cover an unexpected teacher absence. "I'm afraid I need to leave," Margaret repeated. "The students in room 237 they were filming me and making jokes about my age. I don't think I can continue." Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten. He had been dealing with issues of student disrespect increasingly often, particularly towards substitute teachers, and he was growing tired of teenagers who seemed to think that adult authority was optional. But something about this particular situation bothered him more than usual. Maybe it was the dignity with which Margaret carried herself, or the quiet way she described what had happened, without drama or exaggeration. "Mrs. Chen, I'm very sorry this happened," he said sincerely. "Would you mind if I looked at your file before you go? I want to make sure I address the situation appropriately with the students involved." Margaret nodded, not sure why her personnel file would matter, but willing to cooperate if it meant the students might learn something about treating people with respect.
Rodriguez returned to his office and opened his computer, navigating to the substitute teacher database. He found Margaret's file easily enough. She was one of the newer additions to their pool, and double-clicked to open her information. What he saw on the screen made him blink twice, certain he was reading something wrong. The file that opened wasn't the typical substitute teacher resume he was accustomed to seeing. Instead of a simple background in education or retirement from an unrelated career, Margaret Chen's credentials read like something from a science fiction novel. Dr. Margaret L. Chen, Ph.D., Aerospace Engineering, NASA Johnson Space Center, Mission Control Operations. Employment, 1987 to 2018, 31 years. Position, Lead Trajectory Specialist, Mars Exploration Program. Security clearance, Level 5, classified. Notable projects, Mars Pathfinder Landing Calculations, 1997. Spirit and Opportunity Rover Navigation, 2004. Curiosity Rover Precision Landing, 2012. Mars Insight Mission Trajectory, 2018. Awards: NASA Exceptional Achievement Medal, 1998, 2005, 2012. Presidential Unit Citation for Mars Program Excellence, 2015. Lifetime Achievement Award, American Institute of Aeronautics, 2018. Rodriguez read the file 3 times, his hands trembling slightly as the implications of what he was seeing became clear. The elderly woman that his students had just humiliated wasn't some random retiree looking to make extra money as a substitute teacher. She was one of the most accomplished aerospace engineers of her generation, a scientist whose calculations had literally guided humanity's exploration of other planets.
He looked up through his office window to where Margaret was sitting patiently in the waiting area and suddenly saw her completely differently. The outdated glasses weren't a sign of being out of touch. They were the glasses of someone who had spent decades reading complex mathematical equations and technical diagrams. The trembling hands weren't a sign of incompetence. They were the hands that had written calculations that put robots on Mars. The quiet dignity wasn't weakness. It was the composure of someone who had worked under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. Rodriguez grabbed the file and walked quickly back to where Margaret was sitting. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice filled with a respect that hadn't been there before, "I need to ask you something. This file says you worked at NASA for 31 years. Is that accurate?" Margaret looked up, surprised by the change in his tone. "Yes, that's correct. And you were the lead trajectory specialist for the Mars Exploration Program." "Among other things, yes." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the situation. "Mrs. Chen, do you mind if I ask why you're working as a substitute teacher?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. It was a question she had been asked before, although usually not by people who had actually read her background.
"My husband passed away 2 years ago," she said quietly. "We had been married for 54 years, and after he died, I found that staying home alone all day was difficult. I thought teaching might give me a sense of purpose, a way to contribute. I've always enjoyed working with young people, helping them understand how the world works. And the students in that classroom just spent the morning making fun of you because you couldn't operate a smartboard?" Margaret nodded, a sad smile crossing her face. "Technology moves quickly. What I know about computers is related to spacecraft navigation systems and orbital mechanics. Consumer electronics are different." Rodriguez felt a combination of anger and embarrassment wash over him. Anger at the students who had been so cruel to someone whose contributions to human knowledge exceeded anything they might accomplish in their entire lives. Embarrassment that his school had failed to recognize and honor someone who deserved to be treated as the living legend she was. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice firm with decision, "would you be willing to come back to that classroom with me? I think there are some things my students need to learn." 20 minutes later, the students in room 237 were settling into their seats after lunch, expecting to find another substitute teacher or possibly just a free period where they could catch up on homework from other classes. Instead, they found Principal Rodriguez standing at the front of the room with Mrs. Chen beside him, her personnel file open in his hands.
The mood in the room shifted immediately. Principals didn't usually accompany substitute teachers, and the serious expression on Rodriguez's face suggested that their morning entertainment was about to have consequences. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made students sit up straighter and put away their phones without being asked. "I want to talk to you about respect. More specifically, I want to talk to you about the difference between what someone looks like and who they actually are." He gestured toward Margaret, who stood quietly beside him with the same dignity she had maintained all morning. "This morning, many of you found it amusing to mock Mrs. Chen because she had difficulty with the smartboard. You filmed her, you made jokes about her age, and you treated her with a level of disrespect that has no place in this school or anywhere else." The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several of them glanced at their phones where the videos they had taken were still stored, waiting to be shared with friends who hadn't witnessed the morning's entertainment. "What you didn't know," Rodriguez continued, opening Margaret's file, "is that you were mocking one of the most accomplished scientists of the modern era."
He began reading from the file, his voice growing stronger with each achievement. Dr. Margaret Chen, Ph.D. in Aerospace Engineering from MIT, 31 years at NASA Mission Control, lead trajectory specialist for every major Mars mission of the past 2 decades. The calculations she performed put the first successful rovers on Mars. Her work helped humanity take its first steps toward becoming an interplanetary species. The silence in the room was profound. Students who had been laughing just hours earlier now stared at Margaret with expressions of shock and growing embarrassment. "The woman you mocked because she couldn't operate a smartboard," Rodriguez said, his voice rising slightly, "is the same woman who calculated the precise trajectory needed to land a robot on a planet 35 million miles away.
The hands you laughed at for trembling have written equations that most PhD scientists couldn't understand. The mind you assumed was confused because she's 80 years old contains more knowledge about mathematics and physics than everyone in this room combined. Tyler Watson, the student who had made the comment about calling someone to pick up their grandma, was staring at his desk, his face red with shame. "But here's what bothers me most," Rodriguez continued. "It's not just that you were disrespectful to someone who deserved your respect. It's that you made assumptions based on age and appearance, and those assumptions prevented you from learning from someone who could have taught you things that no textbook contains."
He closed the file and looked around the room, making eye contact with as many students as possible. Mrs. Chen didn't come here because she needed the money or because she had nothing else to do. She came here because she wanted to share her knowledge with young people like you. She wanted to help you understand the world and maybe inspire some of you to pursue careers in science and technology. Instead, she was humiliated by students who thought they were smarter than she was. Margaret stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. "If I may," she said, and Rodriguez nodded. "I don't want you to feel ashamed," she said, addressing the students directly for the first time since returning to the room. "I want you to learn something, not about science or mathematics, but about people. Everyone you meet knows something you don't. Everyone has a story, experiences, knowledge that could enrich your life if you're willing to listen instead of judge." She moved toward the whiteboard, picking up a marker with those same trembling hands that had once calculated interplanetary trajectories. "Since you're studying chemical reactions," she said, beginning to write a complex equation, "let me show you the chemical formula for rocket fuel and explain how we use controlled explosions to escape Earth's gravity."
What followed was 45 minutes of the most engaging science lesson most of those students had ever experienced. Margaret didn't just recite textbook information. She told stories about real missions, real problems that her team had solved, real moments when human ingenuity had overcome seemingly impossible challenges. She explained how the same chemical principles they were learning in high school chemistry had been applied to propel spacecraft across the solar system. The students asked questions tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they realized they were speaking with someone who had been personally involved in some of the most significant scientific achievements of their lifetime. Margaret answered each question with patience and detail, clearly enjoying the opportunity to share knowledge she had spent decades accumulating. When the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, none of the students moved to leave. "Mrs. Chen," asked Sarah Kim, the same student who had earlier asked if someone could help the confused old lady, would you be willing to come back and teach us more about space exploration?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn all day. "I would be honored." As the students filed out of the classroom, several of them stopped to apologize personally to Margaret. Tyler Watson was the last to leave, and he approached her desk with obvious nervousness. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm really sorry about what I said earlier, about calling someone to pick up their grandma. That was really stupid." Margaret looked at him with kind eyes. "Tyler, isn't it?" He nodded, surprised that she knew his name.
"Tyler, I've been underestimated many times in my life. When I started at NASA, there were people who thought women couldn't do the math required for space missions. I used that doubt as motivation to work harder and prove them wrong. You have the same choice now. You can let this moment teach you to be better, or you can ignore the lesson and keep making the same mistakes." Tyler nodded solemnly. "I want to be better." "Then be better," Margaret said simply. "And maybe consider taking some advanced mathematics courses. We're going to need brilliant minds like yours if we're ever going to get humans to Mars."
The transformation in how Margaret was treated at Jefferson High School was immediate and profound. Word of her background spread quickly through the student body, and she went from being mocked as a confused elderly woman to being revered as a living legend. Students began requesting her specifically as a substitute teacher, and she was invited to give a presentation to the science club about her career at NASA. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the students approached other people, particularly older adults. The lesson they had learned wasn't just about respecting Margaret Chen, it was about recognizing that everyone they encountered had depths they couldn't see from the surface. 3 months later, Margaret was offered a permanent position as a part-time instructor, teaching an advanced physics course for students interested in aerospace engineering. The course quickly became one of the most popular electives in the school, with a waiting list of students eager to learn from someone who had literally helped humanity reach for the stars.
Principal Rodriguez kept Margaret's personnel file on his desk, not in a folder, but in a frame, as a reminder to himself and his staff that extraordinary people often come in ordinary packages. The story of the substitute teacher became a legend at Jefferson High, passed down from class to class as a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging people by their appearance. And every day, when Margaret wrote equations on the whiteboard with her trembling hands, when she explained complex scientific concepts with the patience of someone who truly loved learning, and when she looked at her students with eyes that had once watched humanity take its first steps toward other worlds, she served as a living reminder that wisdom doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it reveals itself to those who are humble enough to recognize it. The smart board that had caused so much trouble on that first day was eventually replaced with a traditional whiteboard at Margaret's request. She preferred chalk and markers, tools she could control without wondering which button to press. The students didn't mind. They had learned that the medium mattered far less than the message, and the woman delivering that message was someone whose knowledge had helped expand the boundaries of human possibility. In her desk drawer, Margaret kept a folder of thank you letters from students who had gone on to pursue careers in science and engineering, inspired by the day they learned that the elderly substitute teacher they had mocked was actually one of the greatest scientific minds of her generation. Each letter was a reminder that teaching, real teaching, wasn't about mastering technology or following lesson plans, but about sharing the wonder of discovery with minds eager to learn. And sometimes, late at night, Margaret would look up at Mars, visible in the evening sky, and smile, knowing that robots were still rolling across its surface, following paths calculated by her hands, while down on Earth, a new generation of students was learning that the universe was vast and beautiful and waiting for them to explore it, if they were willing to listen to the quiet voices that held the keys to its secrets.